Imagine walking into an Apple store. You pick up the newest iPhone. The aluminum frame feels solid. The display comes alive instantly. The camera captures details that would have seemed impossible just a decade ago. It's one of the most advanced consumer products ever created. But almost nobody asks the most important question. Where was it really made? Turn the phone over and you'll find a familiar sentence. Designed by Apple in California. Assembled in China. Most people stop reading after the last three words. Assembled in China. Sounds simple. As if one factory somewhere in China builds the entire phone from start to finish. But that's not what happens. Not even close. The processor inside your iPhone is designed by Apple in California and manufactured by TSMC in Taiwan. The display technology comes from suppliers in South Korea. Camera components come from companies in Japan and other countries. Specialized chips, sensors, memory, glass and hundreds of tiny components travel from factories across the world. Before a single iPhone reaches your hand, thousands of individual parts have already crossed oceans. Then something remarkable happens. Those parts arrive at exactly the right place. At exactly the right time. To become a single device. For years, that place has been China. Most people think they know why. Cheap labor. Sounds logical. But today, it's no longer the whole story. In fact, for many products, China is no longer the cheapest place to manufacture. Countries like India and Vietnam now offer significantly lower labor costs. If wages were the only reason Apple stayed in China, the company should have left years ago. But it didn't. Why? Because Apple wasn't paying for the cheapest workers. It was paying for something much more valuable. Something almost invisible. Something that took decades to build. And that's exactly why this story matters. Over the last few years, Apple has been expanding production outside China. Some iPhones are now assembled in India. Products like AirPods have expanded into Vietnam. Every few months, headlines appear claiming Apple is finally leaving China behind. But look a little closer, and those headlines start to fall apart. Because despite billions of pounds invested outside China, despite new factories, despite growing political tensions, China still plays a central role in Apple's supply chain. So here's the question that governments, investors, and even Apple executives have spent years trying to answer. If Apple is already moving production, why can't it completely leave China? Is it politics? Is it money? Is it technology? Or is the real answer hiding somewhere nobody bothered to look? The truth is far more surprising than most people imagine. Because Apple doesn't depend on a single factory. It depends on an entire industrial ecosystem. One so advanced, so interconnected, that no country has managed to fully replicate it. And strangely enough, Apple didn't create that system. China did. Long before the first iPhone was ever announced. To understand why Apple still depends on China today, we have to go back almost 50 years. To a small fishing town that almost nobody outside China had ever heard of. Place with dirt roads, wooden boats, and fewer than 60,000 people. Its name was Shenzhen. Nothing suggested it would one day become the heart of the global technology industry. Yet one decision made there would quietly reshape Apple, the smartphone industry, and perhaps the entire modern economy. Because the real story of the iPhone didn't begin in California. It began in Shenzhen. When Steve Jobs walked onto the stage in January 2007 and introduced the first iPhone, the audience saw a revolutionary device. Phone, an iPod, an internet communicator, all combined into one. It looked effortless. But behind that moment was a manufacturing challenge unlike anything Apple had ever attempted. Designing the iPhone was only half the battle. Building millions of identical devices, on time with almost no defects, was the real test. And strangely enough, The foundation for that success had been laid nearly 30 years before the first iPhone even existed. In 1978, Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping launched a series of economic reforms that opened China's economy to foreign investment. 2 years later, in 1980, the Chinese government designated Shenzhen as the country's first special economic zone. At the time, Shenzhen was little more than a fishing town bordering Hong Kong. It had no famous technology companies, no massive factories, no global reputation, but it had something powerful: freedom to experiment. Companies that invested there received tax incentives, fewer business restrictions, and access to rapidly improving infrastructure. Roads were built, ports expanded, industrial parks appeared. Foreign manufacturers began arriving. What happened next wasn't luck. It was momentum. One factory attracted suppliers. Those suppliers attracted logistics companies. Logistics companies attracted packaging firms. Packaging companies attracted machine builders. Machine builders attracted engineers. Within a few years, an entire industrial ecosystem was beginning to take shape. No single company planned it. It simply kept growing because every new business made the next business more valuable. By the 1990s, Shenzhen had become one of the fastest-growing cities in the world. Its population exploded from a small town into a major industrial center in just a couple of decades. Global manufacturers started paying attention. Among them, Taiwanese company called Foxconn, officially known as Hon-Hai Precision Industry. Foxconn specialized in manufacturing electronics for some of the world's biggest technology brands. But one partnership would change everything. Apple. As demand for iPods, and later iPhones, exploded, Foxconn expanded its operations across China. Its largest campuses became manufacturing cities in their own right. The most famous was in Zhengzhou, often nicknamed iPhone City. During peak production periods, hundreds of thousands of workers helped manufacture iPhones there. Yet the workers were only part of the story. What truly impressed Apple wasn't simply Foxconn's size. It was what surrounded it. Within a relatively short distance were thousands of specialized suppliers. One company produced precision screws measured in fractions of a millimeter. Another manufactured tiny camera modules. Others built batteries, connectors, circuit boards, packaging, testing equipment, and highly specialized production machinery. If Apple engineers redesigned a component, suppliers could respond with incredible speed because many of them were already nearby. That proximity mattered. Imagine discovering a problem with an iPhone camera just weeks before launch. In many countries, solving that problem could involve shipping prototypes across borders, waiting for customs clearance, and coordinating with suppliers scattered around the world. In southern China, the supplier, the tooling company, the testing laboratory, and the assembly plant might all be within the same industrial region. Problems that could take weeks elsewhere were often solved in days, sometimes even faster. Former Apple executives have repeatedly explained that this concentration of manufacturing expertise, not simply lower costs, became one of Apple's greatest competitive advantages. By the time the iPhone became the world's best-selling smartphone, Apple wasn't just manufacturing in China. Its entire production system had evolved around one of the most sophisticated industrial ecosystems ever created. For years, the partnership seemed almost impossible to break. Everything changed. Trade war, a global pandemic, and growing geopolitical tension forced Apple to ask a question it had never seriously faced before. What happens if the world's most valuable company depends too heavily on one country? The answer would trigger the biggest manufacturing shift in Apple's modern history. But moving production turned out to be far harder than anyone expected. For more than a decade, Apple's manufacturing system looked almost unstoppable. Every September, millions of people watched a new iPhone launch. A few days later, stores around the world were full of them. From New York to London, Tokyo, The system worked with astonishing precision. Started to crack. The first warning came in 2018. The United States and China entered a trade war. Tariffs were imposed on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods moving between the world's two largest economies. For the first time, Apple had to think beyond efficiency. It had to think about risk. Then came an even bigger shock. COVID-19. Factories temporarily closed. Ports slowed down. Flights were cancelled. Entire cities went into lockdown. The supply chain that had once seemed almost indestructible suddenly became vulnerable. One event made that risk impossible to ignore. In 2022, strict COVID restrictions disrupted production at Foxconn's Zhengzhou campus, often called iPhone City. The facility is one of Apple's most important manufacturing centers. Production delays affected shipments of the high-end iPhone 14 Pro models during the holiday shopping season. For Apple, this wasn't just a temporary problem. It was proof that relying too heavily on a single manufacturing hub could threaten product launches worth billions of dollars. The company already had a plan. Now it had a reason to accelerate it. Instead of trying to replace China overnight, Apple adopted a strategy known across global business as China Plus One. The name explains everything. China would remain a key manufacturing base. But future growth would also come from other countries. India became the biggest part of that plan. Apple's manufacturing partners, including Foxconn, Pegatron and later Tata Electronics, expanded production there. With support from India's production-linked incentive program, more iPhone assembly gradually moved into the country. By 2024, Apple had reached an important milestone. According to company estimates and industry reports, roughly 1 in every 7 iPhones was being assembled in India. That was remarkable. Just a few years earlier, the number had been tiny. Vietnam followed a similar path. Apple expanded production of AirPods, Apple Watch models, iPads and several Mac accessories there. The country quickly became another important piece of Apple's manufacturing network. Around the world, the headlines sounded dramatic. Apple is leaving China. But the reality inside the supply chain looked very different. Because assembling an iPhone is only one step in making an iPhone. Take the display, the battery, the camera modules, the precision connectors, the specialist machinery used to build them. Many still came from suppliers with decades of experience operating in China. Even when final assembly happened somewhere else, a large share of the ecosystem remained exactly where it had always been. That's why Apple wasn't moving one giant factory. It was slowly rebuilding parts of an industrial system that had taken more than 40 years to develop. And that's a completely different challenge. Imagine opening a new restaurant. Buying a building is easy. Hiring a chef is possible. But recreating every trusted farmer, bakery, butcher and food supplier that made the original restaurant successful, that takes years. The same is true for manufacturing. Countries can build factories surprisingly quickly. Building an ecosystem is another matter entirely. Apple discovered that the hard way. Every expansion into India or Vietnam required more than new buildings. It required training workers, developing local suppliers, improving logistics, building specialized tooling, creating quality control systems, and convincing hundreds of smaller companies to grow alongside Apple. Some progress came quickly, other parts moved far more slowly, which explains why Apple isn't choosing between China and India, or China and Vietnam. It's building a network that includes all of them. That strategy may eventually reduce its dependence on China. But one question still remains. Can any country truly recreate what China spent decades building? Because answering that question may tell us not only where the next iPhone will be made, but where the future of global manufacturing itself is headed. So, can Apple ever leave China? The answer is yes, but not in the way most headlines suggest. Apple isn't trapped because of one factory. It isn't trapped because of one contract. And it certainly isn't trapped because labor is the cheapest. The real challenge is something much bigger. It's the ecosystem. Imagine trying to move an entire city instead of a single building. You can construct a new factory in a few years. But you can't instantly recreate the thousands of businesses that support it. You can't suddenly create decades of manufacturing experience. You can't manufacture trust between suppliers overnight. That's why this story isn't really about Apple. It's about how modern products are built. Take an iPhone. By the time it reaches your pocket, hundreds of companies have already contributed to it. Some design chips. Others manufacture displays. Others build batteries. Others create microscopic connectors almost too small to see. Every company depends on another. Every delay affects someone else. It's a chain where every link matters. China spent more than 40 years strengthening those links. That is why replacing them is so difficult. Today, Apple's supply chain is changing. India's role continues to grow. Vietnam is becoming increasingly important. Other countries, including Malaysia and Thailand, are also attracting more electronics investment. The global supply chain is becoming more diverse than it was 10 years ago. That trend is real. And it will almost certainly continue. But diversification doesn't mean replacement. Those are two very different things. Apple isn't packing up and leaving China. It's reducing risk by spreading production across multiple countries while continuing to rely on the strengths each location offers. That's exactly how global manufacturing works today. One country designs. Another manufactures advanced chips. Another produces displays. Another assembles the final product. No single nation does everything. And perhaps, no single nation ever will again. History tells us that manufacturing leadership never stays in one place forever. Britain once led the Industrial Revolution. The United States became the manufacturing powerhouse of the 20th century. Japan transformed global electronics and automobiles. China became the center of modern manufacturing. The next chapter is still being written. India is expanding rapidly. Vietnam continues to attract investment. Automation and artificial intelligence are beginning to reshape factories around the world. Robots are becoming more capable. Production is becoming smarter. But even the most advanced robot cannot instantly replace decades of industrial knowledge. Machines can assemble products. They cannot instantly recreate an ecosystem. And that may be the biggest lesson hidden inside every iPhone. When you look at the words, designed by Apple in California, assembled in China, you're not simply reading a manufacturing label. You're looking at the result of one of the most sophisticated global supply chains ever created. A product designed on one continent, built with components from many others, and brought together through an industrial network that took generations to develop. That's why Apple hasn't completely left China. Not because it doesn't want to prepare for the future, but because replacing an ecosystem is far more difficult than replacing a factory. And perhaps that's the biggest misunderstanding of all. People often think Apple's greatest achievement is the iPhone. But the iPhone is only the final product. The real achievement is the invisible network behind it. Millions of skilled workers. Thousands of specialized suppliers. Ports. Railways. Toolmakers. Engineers. Logistics experts. Quality control teams. All working together with remarkable precision. Most people never see that system. They only see the phone. And maybe that's exactly why it's so easy to underestimate it. The next time you hold an iPhone, turn it over. Read those familiar words one more time. Designed by Apple in California. Assembled in China. Now you'll know that those 4 words don't tell the whole story. They tell the final chapter of a journey that began decades earlier. In a small fishing town called Shenzhen. A journey that helped build the world's most valuable technology company. and changed global manufacturing forever. Because building a revolutionary product is difficult. But building the ecosystem behind that product may be one of the hardest things humanity has ever done.